study that at
Yeah.
Berkeley? Yeah.
No, one of the funny things, there's a type of microphone it's called binaural, but it's basically one of the models. It's basically a head with some really high end microphones where the ears would be. And I was in a class and a teacher brought one of these in. And she's like, okay, everybody put on your headphones and close your eyes. And she whips out a pair of scissors and just goes around the back of the head. And you could actually feel as if it sounded so real, as you could actually, people were going like this. So.
Well, I'm going to mangle this, but that reminds me of something I read a while back about bats that hunt a certain prey, and they do it by they know the sound range in which they can hear this prey, and but then the question is Doppler effect, etc. The speed of the bat, etc.
Right, yeah.
So they have learned to adjust their hearing to find the prey, even though they're moving when the prey is moving. And they did these lab experiments, and then they worked it in reverse, and the bats couldn't trace it, and they concluded this is because bats never learned how to fly backwards. So how did you get from computers to Arlington's ADU?
It was a building permit.
Okay.
My wife and I were considering putting an addition on our house at one point in time, and I was amazed at how much red tape there was, or at least to me it seemed like there was a lot. So when our town started to do a zoning recodification, I volunteered to be on that group and did that. Then went on to the ZBA for a while, and
Not on the disability access,
Got it. Thanks, Nick.
although 20 years ago.
So I think we'll get started. We're a few minutes after 7, so we want to try to keep on schedule if we can. First of all, I want to thank you, all of you who came this evening, certainly everybody who has done so much work to make this possible. Anytime there is an opportunity where people become engaged in the kind of the civic life of their community, I think it's a really important thing. So thank you for being here. 4 weeks ago, we met in Maurer Auditorium in Town Hall, right over there. Some of you were probably there. And we came together to better understand the ways that housing instability is linked to poor physical and mental health for both children and for adults. And with the help of the 3 speakers that we had, Senator Lewis was there as well, and particularly I think the questions and ideas that came from the audience, their engagement, I think we left with a shared appreciation for why housing has emerged as a key social determinant of health. We spoke about the critical role that affordable housing plays in supporting a healthy and socially inclusive community, and that the exorbitant cost of housing in Massachusetts falls particularly hard on the most vulnerable, those who are cognitively challenged, people with compromised health or disabilities, older residents, people on fixed income, people, in fact, who are our neighbors. Tonight, we will hear about a proposed zoning article that will be considered at this November's town meeting, which will be taking place in a couple weeks. And if passed, it will amend Winchester's zoning bylaw to allow for accessory dwelling units on lots where single-family homes or duplexes are allowed. Its purpose to allow for the creation of independent living spaces its purpose is to allow for the creation of independent living spaces for people over the age of 62 and for people with disabilities. We'll hear from our town planner, who will walk us through the bylaw. We will hear from a member of our planning board and from 3 other speakers who will help us understand the experience of other communities that have approved accessory dwelling unit bylaws, the path to approval, the scope of those bylaws, their impact so far, and we will learn more about the housing challenges faced by the people that Winchester's proposed bylaw is meant to serve. Each speaker is going to speak for about 10, 12 minutes or so, and then comes your part. And we're going to try to protect time at the end, maybe 30 minutes or so, for questions and answers. And if there are questions that come to your attention during the course of hearing our speakers, if there are ideas you have, I really encourage you to speak up. We're all friends here. The way that we get the most benefit about these kinds of conversations is to engage in them. So please imagine what you would do if you had a neighbor that was going to propose to construct an accessory dwelling unit, or the questions that might come to your mind if, in fact, you were considering doing that. Be willing to speak so that we give the sponsors of this bylaw as much of an idea as possible about the kinds of concerns and questions that they, in fact, might receive when when presenting at the town meeting in a few weeks. I'm going to do my best to encourage and moderate, and otherwise I'm just getting out of the way. So let me just say a couple more things before our speakers start. I think we are all aware of this, but the growing shortfall in housing units in Massachusetts is severe, and it's getting worse. On our current trend, if we don't do something about it, we may be looking at 300,000 or 400,000 units, which we will need but don't have. Smaller homes are being taken down in Winchester, and larger, expensive homes are going up. That's a sign, in a way. It's related to the kinds of situations we're experiencing throughout the state with regards to housing. Some older residents in Winchester who have raised their children and built their friendships here over generations must move. They leave our community not because they want to, but because they need to reduce their housing costs, or they need a smaller space in which to live. Some older residents in this time of high inflation, and we know this through the Jenks Center, make choices between food and medicine and housing costs and become more isolated as their financial burdens grow. People with disabilities who could live independently if there was an affordable option, or a unit with a family member or another supportive person nearby, must choose group housing or another housing option that may not be as appropriate to living a meaningful life within the community of their choice. And in some ways, these are losses for all of us. And what can we do? What should we do about this? We know that creating more affordable housing options in meaningful numbers in Winchester requires multi-unit development, such as the several housing projects that are either underway or approved or being considered. But this warrant article that we will discuss tonight is meant to provide another housing option on a much smaller scale for some members of our community. And in many ways, the proposed amendment asks us to reimagine Winchester for the 21st century as part of a more diverse and a more equitable Commonwealth. So if we want to strengthen Winchester as we've been, a caring and connected community for people of all ages and abilities that aspires to equity and diversity and inclusion, not leaving people behind, and we want this long-standing character of our community to carry deep into the 21st century, what priorities and values must we affirm? What housing strategies and policies should we embrace? Is there a place for an accessory dwelling unit bylaw as part of an overall effort to create more affordable housing options within our community? What benefits should we expect? What change will this bring to our neighborhoods? And so with your engagement tonight and the help of our speakers, I hope that we leave here with a better understanding of the bylaw that's being proposed, and that the folks who are sponsoring it will be better prepared to advocate for it at town meeting in a couple weeks. So let's get started. So our first speaker is Brian Zakelli. No? Okay, that's what I had understood. We're making this up as we go. Well, who do you think ought to be the first speaker?
I was going to go through the mechanics of the Winchester bylaw.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to, yep.
Okay, well, let me tell you the order that I was thinking of so it doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. So, Brian, you would go first, talking about the bylaw, right? Kind of walking everybody through it. Then, Yijing, I thought that you might go next to talk about the planning board's perception of this and why it's important to bring it forward. And then, Amy, you can give us a kind of the broader perspective of what other communities are doing. Steve, if you could talk about your experience in Arlington. And then, Kathy, you know, your experience and all the things that you've been involved with in terms of disability, housing, and stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Tom, if it's okay, if I can, my part is really short. It's more of a big picture, and we were thinking that Brian could get into the details.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. This is the kind of flexibility that we like to exhibit. All right?
Hi, my name is Iching Scott. I'm a member of one of 5 members of the planning board. Our chair, Dia Jarius, is here as well, and our vice chair, Sally Dale, and our town planner, Brian Zakelli, of course. I'm fairly new to the planning board, 1.5 years or so. My last elected position was, can you hear? Yes. Was president of my kindergarten class, and that's my full political career. So excuse me if I'm a little bit nervous up here. I wanted to give a big picture perspective on what this is, and it's we're proposing this bylaw as one tool of many to address some of the housing crisis that we are all experiencing, and to Tom gave us such a great sort of rich picture of it. I'm in real estate, so I know the numbers. In 2019, the single family median price of Winchester was $1.2 million. 2022 in September, 1.5. So it has increased 100,000 per year since the pandemic. So, I mean, it's incredible. And, you know, a lot of us have all felt that and know neighbors and friends who have suffered through it. So this ADU bylaw is not new in the imagination of our nation, of our town even, or of our state. You know, it's something that, you know, people have known forever, you know, like a carriage house or an in-law suite, a nanny suite, something to help families adjust to the building throughout the life cycle of it. So, you know, I want to acknowledge that, you know, this idea has been in the works in Winchester. You know, in Envision, and many of you probably have worked on this, in Envision Winchester in 2014. It was mentioned that we need more diversity of housing. In the Housing Production Plan of the Select Board in 2018, you know, ADUs were specifically called out as a way to mitigate some of the stresses that we're feeling here. And in the master plan of 2020 that the planning board is in charge of, it is one of the ways that we can provide variability and flexibility for people. And even in the climate action plan, right, it calls out for addressing some of the housing needs of the most vulnerable in our population in order to mitigate some of the climate emergencies and crises that we are experiencing, including the pandemic. So this particular bylaw is to bring in this idea of an ADU, but in a very, comparably fairly modest way compared to, you know, California, say, or even some of our neighboring towns like Arlington and, you know, Lexington and Wellesley, Belmont. They all have variations of this law. What we're trying to do is to really give some kind of relief to some of the most vulnerable populations, including those with disabilities and those over the age of 62. And so we're trying to allow for the legality of it. So we know we're not oblivious to the fact that these things exist in our town. They do, but they are not legal. And for someone who is, and Kathy will speak to this very specifically, for those who really need some federal or state aid for housing, that illegality is not okay for accessing those funds, and that is a very serious and practical thing that this bylaw would address. So I think some of the reactions to it immediately is how is it going to change the look and feel of our neighborhoods, and this bylaw addresses that in ways to mitigate some of the those concerns, right? So there off-street parking is required. It needs to look and feel like the main house. It needs to be the entrance needs to be a accessory to the main dwelling, right? So these things, and it has to be up to a maximum of 900 only. So these things are small. They're gonna be in line with the look and feel of the neighborhoods. And this is a way that, nationally it's been kind of a gentle density, right? It's housing, that hidden in within already existing infrastructure. So I'll let Brian take you through some of the mechanics of it, because it's been thought out through really deliberately by the ADU working group. Many people here are part of it. Felicity from Housing Partnership, Lisa from DAC, John Serbier from Housing Partnership, Kathy. And it's been very deliberate since December, trying very, very hard to make it open and welcoming and sort of hearing a lot of voices. So this is from a lot of hard work, and I'll let Brian take you through that.
Thank you so much. Might need that remote from you, Amy.
Brian, do you want your box?
Wasn't sure where you were going with that. So hi, my name is Brian Zacchelli. My name is Brian Zacchelli. I'm the town planner. I'm going to just get right into it with, that was a great intro in terms of this is the culmination of about a year or so of several different groups that I Ching had mentioned. How the town is viewing accessory dwelling units is there are three different types. We are reviewing them all the same, but if you look at different communities, sometimes some are reviewed differently than others. Mainly detached ones might have a different process than interior or attached ones. In Winchester, we're basically saying, we're calling it an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. There are other names. It is secondary, but can be within the existing in these three ways. In an interior one, like a basement or part of the house. Attached, like a normal addition that you would put on your house, or an outbuilding, or a detached structure. So in its existing garage or something like this. So it has to be independent, like was said a little bit earlier. So the population served specifically for this bylaw. So these are individuals that have a disability as defined by Mass General Law. They require independent living units in order to gain the subsidy and support services they need. So this is a huge benefit to this population. And seniors over the age of 62. This really allows residents that are here right now in Winchester to stay in town and age in place, specifically near friends, family, and familiar faces and places. So this is just a couple of different scenarios that we could envision here in Winchester. So the larger house is, you have an owner and a renter, and these are multiple different ways of iterations of of it being possible here in Winchester. So in the top left, you could see where you have someone who has a disability or is older than 62 living in the main house, and they're renting out a house for young professionals in town. Or you could have it the other way, if we keep going to the right here, where you have a family with the grandparents living in the accessory dwelling unit. Following down, you could have a recent grad that happens to have a disability, could have his or her own space, and this one's a little flipped where the owner are older or disabled and the owner is living in the ADU where the young family is living in the main house. This allows adaptability and flexibility over time for all the beneficiaries of this potential bylaw. Whoop. Not sure what happened there.
Power go out?
I don't think so. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, the rest of it is actually, there are 2 slides on here that are really the main part of the bylaw. And I could probably, yeah, it would really be helpful. I mean, I know them, or I could read them off the bylaw, but that's really not going to help a lot of people here. So let me see.
There we go.
Just wanted to keep everyone on their toes, make sure you're still excited about this. So, so the use here. So the use as the accessory unit is by right. That doesn't mean that there's no review. Obviously, there's town departments, building department, engineering department, planning department sometimes. But it's just the use. So it's not like there is no review. So there would be 1 accessory dwelling unit allowed per lot. So there either is an existing single family or a duplex there now, or there would be if there is a lot where there's allowed to be 1, you would only be able to do 1 ADU per lot. The owner of the property or the trust beneficiary, as in like a special needs trust, for example, the owner or the trust beneficiary, they must reside in either unit. So that's another restriction. So these are all restrictions specific to Winchester after a lot of debate over a number of different bylaws, a number of meetings over the past year, like I said. So like I think this is the, like I said, at least 1 occupant has to be either 62 or disabled. And the maximum, so this is the dimensions here of, it's a maximum of 2 bedrooms would be allowed. And it has to be less than 50% of the square footage of the main house or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. So 900 is the max. You can't do anything over 900 square feet. Still going here a little bit more. So as someone said earlier, there would be 1 space that would be that would have to be off-street dedicated for that unit. At least 1. There could be more. The exterior changes must be, the word says, similar in style as the dwelling unit. As the main house, yes, not the accessory unit, the dwelling unit. So certification would be required that there is someone living in either of these units that either is 62 years of age or has a disability. That happens every year or during a change of ownership. That's another kind of check that based upon feedback that we'd received, that people wanted to have that assurance that at change of ownership, what is actually happening? How do we know, does the building partner get aware of that? So the ZEO, the zoning enforcement officer, they're the person who would be able to inspect the, and implement this bylaw. So that was pretty quick, and there will be a lot of time for questions about Winchester's specific bylaw. There is a copy of it here if you'd like to take a look at it. So thank you so much.
Let me just introduce you. I'll never my keep here. So thanks, Brian. So we'll come back as Brian says, there'll be plenty of time for questions, so if you have them or you're thinking about it, please do that. Our next speaker is Amy Dane, who is an independent consultant in public policy research and writing. Her focus is on housing policy and suburban planning in Massachusetts. In 2018, she published a study on zoning for accessory dwelling units in 100 cities and towns in Greater Boston. And Amy's going to provide us with an overview of the ADU legislation and what other municipalities are doing and stuff. Okay.
Thank you.
Did that sound like you?
Just check this is working. Turn it on. Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to talk about ADU regulation in Eastern Massachusetts. I've conducted 2 studies of zoning in Eastern Massachusetts. The first one I did in 2004, and I surveyed the zoning bylaws and ordinances in 187 cities and towns, all of the cities and towns within 50 miles of Boston, except for Boston itself. And then in 2017, 2018, I had the opportunity to update parts of that study, and I surveyed the zoning bylaws and ordinances that time for 100 cities and towns in Greater Boston, all the cities and towns shown in this picture, except for Boston itself. I wasn't looking at the city, at Boston. And in that survey of zoning for ADU bylaws and ordinances, I found that Winchester is in the minority of cities and towns in Greater Boston, that the majority of cities and towns in Greater Boston have adopted an ADU bylaw or ordinance. Now, this goes back several decades, because in my work, I was reading the housing production plans and the master plans for all the cities and towns. And going back to the 90s, they were recommending in a lot of places to adopt ADU bylaws and allow in-law apartments. And so the progress at the ground level from cities and across cities and towns has been slow and gradual over the decades of cities and towns adopting these. And it's a ton of work. You can only imagine how much work has happened here, and you're at this event today, and there are public hearings, and somebody has to draft the legislation. There needs to be a vote. Sometimes it passes, sometimes it doesn't. It comes back. So it's a huge amount of work to get there. This is where we got to by 2018, that out of 100 cities and towns that I was looking at, 68 allowed ADUs, at least on some properties, or for some types of houses, and 32 had no zoning for ADUs in their zoning ordinances and bylaws. But even though I found that 68 cities and towns had zoning for ADUs, 31 of those restricted residency to relatives of the homeowner or caretakers, basically saying if you have an ADU, you can't rent it out. So it was a much smaller number. I think it came to 37. So many, this is on the next slide. Yeah, it is 37 cities and towns had zoning for ADUs that let you rent them out to people. But as I looked into the details, the big theme of my research has been that the zoning is highly restrictive for ADUs. So I'm going to run through some examples of like restrictions, and these aren't sort of examples like, hey, you should do this in Winchester, but just to give you a sense the kinds of restrictions that get adopted. So in Weston, ADUs can be added to homes that have at least 3,000 square feet of floor area. Now the homes in Weston are really large, but 3,000 square feet is a pretty high threshold for adding an ADU. In Manchester by the Sea, ADUs can go on lots that are twice the minimum lot size for the zoning district. So if you have enough land to have 2 houses, then you can add an ADU to your single-family house. In Medfield, ADUs can be added to houses built before 1938 that are at least 2,000 square feet. Now, I looked it up. It took until the 1990s before the average size of new houses in the Northeast was 2,000 square feet. But also importantly, Medfields is one of the communities that grew primarily after 1938, like in the 1950s, 60s, sort of driven by car mobility. And suburban growth in that era. So most of their homes aren't qualifying. In Hudson and a lot of towns, ADUs have to have 2 off-street parking spaces. In Duxbury, an ADU can be added, but the primary house cannot be expanded to accommodate an ADU. There can be no exterior changes. So that doesn't, work for a lot of people. And in Hamilton, an ADU can take up to no more than 15% of the gross floor area of a home, and as we just heard in Winchester, you're looking at 50%. So like 15% is really small amount of the home that it can take up. In Westwood, the number of permitted ADUs cannot exceed 2% of the number of single-family and 2-family homes in the town. And this one's been changed, but this is from my 2018 research because I think they adopted an ADU bylaw since then. But in Belmont, ADUs were allowed only to preserve historic accessory buildings like carriage houses, so they weren't allowed in the house. And then the one other one I just wanted to mention was that when I did my research back in 2004 in Hamilton at that time, it said that you could add an ADU to your house if you had 10 acres of property. So if you had 8 acres, you couldn't add an ADU. But they changed it, and actually their new bylaw says that I think there's like no minimum land area needed to put one in. So they kind of like went the other direction. And then just to summarize, actually, here, ADU regulations can cover any number of these items on the menu. So some just touch on 1 or 2 or 3 items. Some cover a lot of them, but it's a lot. Say, the home has to be 4 years old in Newton, where I live, and they're reconsidering that right now to allow it in new construction because it's really a pain to like build a house without that planned in and then wait 4 years and have to add it. The rules on the minimum lot size, minimum floor area of houses, caps on ADU production town-wide, whole number of things. And a lot of places have risky permitting processes. The last one where it could be by right or special permit, and I think that's great that you're looking at by right. I think that it's a big deal for a lot of homeowners to undertake this process if they're not sure what the outcome's going to be. And one other thing that I looked at was whether or not cities and towns allowed detached ADUs, so like backyard cottages. And this is really a new thing. I think when you look back at the ordinances from like the 80s and 90s, maybe it wasn't as common, and more places are thinking about this. Although maybe some of them are older, but I definitely think a lot of people are considering this now, the allowing a detached unit. And for some homeowners, they want to build an ADU, but it just works better for their house and their lives to have like a separate unit in the backyard. So I think it's great to allow it. There are 16 out of the 100 that have some provisions in their bylaw for detached backyard cottages, but I hope that number will increase. My main takeaway from the survey is just that local ADU regulations across the region highly limit the number of qualifying homes and overall discourage people from adding ADUs. The ADU regulations, one of the things I looked at in my last study was whether they had adopted a new bylaw or ordinance or revised their bylaws or ordinances in the 10 years before I did the study. So these are the places that had, that's, I guess, at least 16 municipalities had revised them over a decade. And when I talk about this being slow and a lot of work, you can see that pace of change is kind of slow. Like I'm looking at 100, Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns. So to sort of make progress on this statewide, it's a very slow process. Tons of work. And then I just put at the bottom, this isn't a formal survey, but I've heard about new bylaws and ordinances in Everett, Needham, Arlington, Belmont, and Wellesley since I did my study. So it's definitely on agendas. You're not the only ones looking at this. And all of them allowed it unrestricted. You don't have to be a relative of the homeowner, or no restrictions on occupancy, except for Needham, where in that case, it's just for in-laws, just for relatives. And I think I actually was invited to a forum there last year because after they adopted that, they're now considering doing something more liberal, allowing people to rent them out. Oh, and then I asked how many ADUs have been permitted in the last 3 years, and I asked that question, in like 2017 when I was making the calls. I called some building inspectors, a lot of planners, and people didn't always have exact answers, and these often came off the top of their head, but it's easier to remember if it was like 1 or 2 units, and that's generally like what people reported. There were a few municipalities that got a bit higher, like 5 units. Bellingham's numbers look huge here, but that's because they have people renew their permits for ADUs, and they sent out like a big letter the year that I was calling, and so they had that 18 was like a response to that, but that wasn't actually like permitting of new ADUs constructed. Then I also asked how many ADUs have been permitted altogether, like in the lifetime of allowing ADUs in your municipality. And these were the answers I got. I don't know if you can read those from where you are. But basically the takeaway is like none of them have like more than 100 ADUs like in the whole town ever permitted. Or there was one that was like maybe just over 100. But mostly it's in the tens. And there are a few places where they just said it was very rare. We really like hardly have them. And this is, I think, probably because the bylaws and ordinances are very restrictive. And I think that it's telling that in California, where they liberalized ADU regulation statewide, that the permitting rates have gone way up, which I think is just more evidence that our numbers are like particularly low because the regulations are very restrictive. And I just wanted to share this quote because I spent so many years like reading regulations that sometimes you come across like kind of weird things. So this was in Peabody zoning in their ADU ordinance that the building inspector will inspect abandoned accessory living areas without the need of a warrant by providing reasonable notice to the owner-occupied applicant on a yearly basis to make sure they stay discontinued. So this is like you had an ADU, you no longer have a permit for it, you have to remove the kitchen, and now the building inspector is supposed to go yearly and just inspect that it's still like not occupied. It sounds like a lot of work, and I think that a lot of these things, when I followed up with planners on a lot of the enforcement and the regular recertification, that a lot of it isn't actually like enforced. Or like Bellingham one year, they're like, oh, let's send out letters and get people to renew, but often those sort of things get written in and aren't necessarily followed up on. Yeah, so I'll close the presentation with a little advocacy push. Please do support zoning for ADUs. Allowing production of more ADUs addresses our housing affordability crisis in a few ways. So typically ADUs are priced smaller, that are priced relatively affordably for being smaller in size than most other residences, and like your ordinance or bylaw has actually restrictions on how big an ADU can be. So it will be like relatively affordable in the town. New housing supply reduces the scarcity that drives up price escalation and bidding wars. The more housing we have, the fewer bidding wars we will have. And ADU liberalization will bring down construction costs by supporting the growth of a competitive industry, delivering ADUs at scale. And that's what we've really heard from the California case, is as soon as you start allowing more ADUs to be produced across the region predictably, like they're gonna be permitted if you qualify, you'll see more companies sort of entering this space to be building them, and that will bring down the construction costs compared to what they are now when you want to build an ADU and it's not as common a project. Personally, I think the state legislature should allow ADUs directly, and do it all at once and say that if you have a single family home, you can add an ADU. But in the meantime, while the state legislature isn't acting on that, it's really important that the cities and towns take this up and continue to make progress. So thank you for looking into this. Thank you for considering it. And I look forward to talking to you more in the Q&A. And also just, you can check out my website and follow me on social media. That's my info. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. So it's great to have that overview, right? Like what's going on in the metropolitan area, what's been the experience? Is there a big flood of applications and creation of new units? In some ways, I sort of wish there was, but there doesn't seem to be anywhere. But on the other hand, it's something that other towns have gone before us, and hopefully we'll get there ourselves. But our next speaker is Stephen Revelak. Steve is a town meeting member in Arlington, where he also serves on the Arlington Redevelopment Board. He previously served on Arlington's Zoning Board of Appeal and was involved with Arlington's 2018 zoning bylaw recodification and the passage of its ADU bylaw. Steve will speak to us about Arlington's experience in gaining approval, sort of what that pathway looked like and sort of where they ended up and what the impact has been since it was passed. Okay?
So the way I looked at it is tonight I'm going to basically tell you the story of how Arlington came to have an ADU bylaw, which basically gets into the 3 Ps: process, politics, and policy. Arlington's consideration of ADUs goes back a long time. Back in 1988, we had a housing crisis not too far removed from what we have today, and Arlington had a fair housing committee that issued a report with some suggestions on what to do about housing. And one of them was to allow more accessory apartments, which would also provide, smaller, more affordable rental units that were, really needed in town. The idea apparently didn't have legs at the time because 30 years later, town meeting would be talking about it. So my first experience with ADUs as a town meeting member was when an article came forward in 2019. It was inspired by our housing production plan, basically to provide, an additional type of housing, accommodate, households that needed an at-home caretaker or to allow someone to age in place. The 2019 version of our ADU bylaw, or the 2019 proposal for an ADU bylaw, was a fairly restrictive one. It would have allowed ADUs only in single-family homes and only in single-family districts. The ADU would have had to have been contained within a single-family home as it existed on February 14th, 2019. So there was sort of like a cutoff date for the envelope of the building. Consequences of that is, well, it would have prohibited detached ADUs, like sort of the backyard cottage. It would have prevented someone from building an addition in order to have an ADU. And it would have prevented someone from using a portion of the house that happened to have been constructed as an addition after February of 2019 to have an ADU at some later point in time. Parcels that were non-conforming or had undersized lots. In Arlington, most of our lot requirement is 6,000 square feet and 60 feet of frontage, but there are a lot of non-conforming parcels that don't meet those dimensions. They would not be able to have an ADU. There was a minimum rental term of 1 year, a prohibition on sublets. All ADUs would have required a special permit along with annual recertification that the owner lived in the primary residence or the ADU. So it was, like I said, it was a fairly restrictive proposal. It didn't do badly at town meeting. We got a 62% threshold out of the 2/3 required, so it was 9 votes short. But one of our residents, a town meeting member, was very passionate about accessory dwelling units, so she brought this idea back as a citizen article in 2020. Now, the main changes between 2019 and the 2020 proposal were, well, that instead of requiring a special permit and having to go in front of the ZBA, ADUs would be allowed by right in any district that allowed residential uses. The other main difference was to allow them in single or two-family dwellings instead of just one. Now, the redevelopment board at that time recommended no action on the article, mostly due to technical stuff like drafting and scope. So it just, sort of sat there for, through 2020. But this particular resident, in the next year, she was determined. She hooked up or collaborated, found a couple of land use attorneys that were willing to collaborate with her. And, they went to work on the thing together and produced something that was pretty polished. So one of the fundamental ideas, polished coming back to town meeting in 2021, last year. So one of the fundamental ideas that, they sort of followed was to stick to the existing zoning as much as possible and to avoid restrictions that didn't exist in other contexts. So it allowed ADUs in single or two-family dwellings in all districts where those uses are permitted. So it permitted both attached and detached ADUs. ADUs were allowed by right, with one notable exception. If you are doing a detached ADU, like converting an old garage, and it's within 6 feet of a property line, that'll require a special permit, but again, otherwise it's by right. The size is limited to 900 square feet, consistent with the definition in state law. There are no restrictions when the property is sold. You can build an addition to build an ADU. We have a prohibition on using them as short-term rental properties. This is in our town bylaw and our zoning bylaw. It's kind of the belt and suspenders kind of thing. They can't be condoized or sold separately from the primary structure. There's no additional parking required. And the only sort of certification, there's a one-time certification process. So before a building permit is issued, the owner must certify that they will live in one of the two dwellings. Now, at town meeting, when this was brought up, there were something around, I think, 15 amendments proposed. And after a very long night of deliberation, the article was passed as submitted. So we have Arlington has a fairly permissive ADU article. The approval rate was, or the final vote was 79% in approving, and most of a 3-hour town meeting session. So that's a year ago. How have we been doing? Well, we approved our first ADU this past September, about a month ago. So this was one of the cases that had to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals because the homeowner was converting a garage. From the way the ZBA's decision describes it, the owners had lived in town for 40 years. They owned a two-family home, and they wanted to convert the garage to an ADU, move into it, and then rent the other two dwelling units out as a way to just age in place. They were approved, and one of our goals was to provide a way for residents to age in place, additional housing options, and it's good to see that our first one actually met that mark. Thank you.
Kathy, let me get up there for a second. Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. So it's really interesting. There are many people here who are veterans of town meeting. It sounded very familiar. The multiple bites at the apple over a number of years, the 3-hour debate, all of that. But anyway, congratulations for getting there. So our last speaker is Kathy Boyle, and Kathy is a commissioner of the Winchester Housing Authority, a member of the Winchester Housing Partnership Board, and she's president of Autism Housing Pathways, which is a nonprofit organization that helps Massachusetts residents with disabilities and their families find or create housing options. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College, holds a certificate of graduate studies from UMass Boston in adapting curriculum, and a certificate in Aging and Disability Resource Centers counseling from the Center for Aging and Disability Education and Research at Boston University School of Social Work. Kathy is an expert on bylaw provisions needed to enable elders and particularly disabled adults to receive state and federal funding in Section 8 rentals. We heard Yijing mention that. And Kathy will speak about what the proposed bylaw may mean to disabled adults and their families.
Look at that. All right. Let's see if it works. Look at that. Yay. Okay. So I want to start by talking about disability in Winchester. In 2020-2021 school year, there were over 100 students in Winchester with autism or an intellectual disability or a vision impairment or a hearing impairment. Additionally, about twice as many Winchester residents ages 18 to 34 have vision impairments, cognitive impairments, difficulties with self-care, and difficulties with independent living, as do those ages 35 to 64. What's going on? Well, probably younger disabled adults are living with their parents and then priced out of town when that arrangement is no longer viable. And moving out of town causes a loss of what is called natural supports. Neighbors, friends, acquaintances, a familiar environment. You can go to the store and people know who you are and they make allowances for you. And so how do we make it possible for these folks to stay in town, basically? And one of the issues is that accessing key disability services legally requires a separate unit. A primary way of providing supportive services to adults with developmental disabilities is the Department of Developmental Services Shared Living Program. In this program, the caregiver is required to live in the same unit as the person with the disability. By statute, the shared living provider cannot be the parent, and the shared living cannot be provided in the same legal unit as the parent. Similarly, there's the Mass Health Adult Family Care / Adult Foster Care program. And the difference between these two is that shared living is a waiver service and there can be waiting lists, whereas adult foster care is an entitlement. So if you qualify for it, you can get it. And in the Mass Health Adult Family Care, Adult Foster Care program, the caregiver must live in the same legal unit as the person with the disability. When the person is a young adult, a parent who is not a guardian might function as the adult family care provider. But it's really hard to do that when you're 85 years old. So it can't go on forever because mom and dad living forever is not a plan. But to access the adult foster care program, the adult with a disability needs to live with a caregiver in a separate legal unit from the family. All right. Now, let's say our adult with a disability has received a portable housing voucher. They can, as a reasonable accommodation for disability, rent from family, but they must live in a legal separate unit. And for the purposes of a housing voucher, the unit must have a stove and an oven and an entrance from the outside or from a public hall so that it is not necessary to go through anyone else's unit to enter. I would point out that for a lot of families, the rent from that housing voucher is essential to pay for supplemental care beyond what is covered by Mass Health or DDS. This is particularly important for the approximately 40+% of adults with autism who have too many skills to qualify for either shared living or adult foster care, but lack sufficient skills to live independently. Which means mom and dad are footing the bill for any supportive services that they need out of pocket beyond what they might be able to get from DDS individual supports, which frankly is maybe 10 hours a week. So where this all comes down to is that ADUs are a home where services can work. They make it possible if you are to access shared living or adult foster care if the accessory unit has 2 bedrooms. And this is really important because what this does is it allows you to access shared living or adult foster care where the unit is the home of the person with a disability. The average duration of a shared living arrangement in Massachusetts is 3 years. Standard shared living involves, oh, you're going to go live in somebody's guest room. Well, in 3 years, when that person says, I don't want to do this anymore, the person with a disability has to move. And so it is, and that's the average is 3 years. The median is less. So it is not at all uncommon for people with disabilities to have to move every 1 to 2 to 3 years. Allowing the family to control property in this way allows you to create a home for the person with a disability. Where if their caregiver quits, they get a new caregiver, but they don't have to move. It also allows people to utilize a portable housing voucher. They can still receive support from their family who are right next door. And it preserves the natural supports provided by a familiar community with family, friends, and neighbors present. And an additional bullet point I did not add, but I was reminded, Tom, when you were talking about the thing last month. A study came out of Connecticut that was done, I think it was published in 2021, but the research was done in 2018, 2019, I think. And what they looked at was that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who were able to choose who they lived with had 74% fewer emergency department visits. So this is a big deal. It's a big deal. On a personal note, one of the things that we all saw during COVID was a very high death rate in group homes. And even if that was not the outcome, there was a side effect. I was not allowed to visit my son in his group home for 3 months. And as a result, my son thinks, because he has severe obsessive compulsive disorder, I'm not supposed to be there. Even though lockdown ended in July of 2020, he still thinks I'm not supposed to be there. So I see him on the front steps for 5 to 10 minutes a week because he won't let me in the house because I don't belong there. This kind of arrangement prevents that kind of thing from happening. So I'll leave it right there. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Kathy. So, you know, you've heard a variety of things, right? I mean, we've heard about the bylaw that's being proposed. You know, the elements of it, how expansive or how restrictive it is. We've heard about the experience of other communities. We've heard about Arlington's experience and how they started with a very restrictive bylaw and then it became more expansive and more liberal. And we've heard about the tremendous impact that the kinds of hoops and regulations that affect families with disabled people within them that they have to go through and the challenges that presents. And the way in which an ADU bylaw may in fact provide tremendous both emotional and financial relief for those families. So does anybody, I want to encourage you to, if you have any questions about it, as I said, I was trying to think about, okay, well, how would I jump into this if I were listening? And I was trying to imagine, oftentimes zoning people become really engaged when it becomes more personal. So if you can imagine, having somebody in your family that might benefit from this, or a neighbor that might wish to do this and the impact that it would have on you and your property, whatever it is that you might be concerned about, does this bylaw, as you understand it, the one that town meeting will be discussing in a few weeks, how does it strike you? And is it enough? Is it too much? Is it a good thing, a good place to start? What do you think?
I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah,
This is very interesting.
yeah, yeah.
My question is, do they have to have their own kitchen and their own bathroom?
Yes,
Everything has to be separate,
yes,
and their own entrance?
yes,
Does there have to be a handicapped entrance?
no.
Okay. And, you can't share, like if I took 2 bedrooms in my house, you
In
can't
terms
share.
of tapping into the benefit programs I talked about, no. It has to be a legal, separate unit.
Can everybody hear everybody, by the way? And do we need this for other purposes? For
questions.
no, okay, but not for WinCam or something like that?
Well, they can hear.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
Anyway, Betty, thank you for that question. Was that all answered?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yes?
I had never heard the word ADU before 10 a.m. this morning.
Yeah.
So this is all very new to me.
Right.
I did have a question for I-Ching Scott. At the very outset, you mentioned that Lexington and Arlington had moved ahead with the idea of the ADU. And I wondered why Winchester, their neighbor, had failed to do so for such a long time. And my question to you is, do you think that the housing crisis in Winchester is acute enough now to move the needle? What is your sense of that? And I ask that because my husband and I are locked in a very small bylaw change in the town of Tewksbury, very, very small, but it has been impossible to move the people on the planning board and the 20 or so citizens who come to every planning meeting and block any kind of change, because they are very interested in protecting their property values, their self-interest. So are you optimistic that if you go through this entire process, there will be a good outcome?
I would love for Amy to weigh in on this too, because Amy knows a lot of these towns and how they've gone through these processes. So right now, we are introducing it. Did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say that the percentage that we had to pass zoning by in prior years was 2/3. That, by virtue of a legislative change statewide, is now 50%. And that hasn't happened to come up, and it is actually very favorable with respect to zoning changes. Now back to EJ.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. The process is that unanimously on the planning board we are introducing this bylaw to town meeting. So it's in the hands of town meeting now, and like Felicity said, it will be a majority vote on whether or not to okay this. So this is in the hands of the town now, right, or town meeting really. So I'm optimistic because we are looking at some of the most strained populations, right? So our houses are huge, they're old, they are not suitable for aging in place, right? You need to widen the doorways, you need to adjust the kitchens and the baths, and there's just so much to renovate and to upkeep in a large home. If we do allow this, property owners would be able to stay within town, build a new structure that is made for aging in place, right? That these homes that we have were designed for nuclear families and large nuclear families where, uses of it have changed over time, right? Households are getting smaller over the pandemic. Young folks like 18 to late 20s, 50% of them were living with their parents, right? These are multi-generation households that are our demographics are completely changing in America. So, these buildings made in last century need to be made iterations for, and our zoning doesn't allow for that yet. But I think that there is a desire for that to change. I'm hopeful, and that there would be 50% or more.
So the planning board, I take it as we'll vote unanimously to advance this.
Yes,
Yeah.
we did.
I don't want to get ahead of you, but and I'm not sure about the select board, but we do have a select board member here. Mike, do you have any prognostication on the board?
Thanks, Felicity. We did vote unanimously in favor of this, and we welcomed changes through this process. And the planning board, I think, last night voted unanimously as well. So, and it's a great opportunity for the town because the Council on Aging is also a sponsor of it, the Affordable Housing Trust, and also the Housing Partnership Board, and I'm not sure some others. So it's unique for us that there's all these stakeholders that are supporting it, and they have done so unanimously. So that's impressive, and I think that it speaks to the need here. And as Felicity said, we jumped on this right away when the Housing Choice Bill passed at the state level, and accelerated our mission. I think with all of the different elected bodies, because that moving that threshold from 2/3 to majority is really, really significant. As you saw in Arlington, as Stephen mentioned, it's really hard to work on something and then just come up, 10 votes or 9 votes shy, and you can't just keep on going back to the well to town meeting that. So we're getting a lot of community support behind this, and so we look forward to favorable action from town meeting as well.
Hopefully that'll be the case. Yes, sir.
What's that?
Thank you, everybody, for all the information. So just to disclose my bias, I think it's a wonderful type of, an idea, and it's absurd to me that it hasn't happened already, to be very frank with you. In imagining this whole process, which sounds very favorable in terms of the way it's manifesting, but it's very easy for me to understand the concept when the ADU is a separate dwelling from the house. I imagine a scenario where you have a separate electric panel for the main dwelling and an ADU that has a separate panel, separate electric service, separate plumbing, a separate egress, not attached in any way whatsoever. But in scenarios where, let's say the ADU is connected to the home, what actually constitutes, the ADU being a separate type of a dwelling than the main home? I imagine, again, just a side entrance, but, do you have to separate the panels, separate mailboxes, all those things?
Who would like to respond to that?
I can start on that. To specifically address it in terms of, for example, how a housing voucher considers something to be a legal separate unit, it has to have its own food preparation area, including an oven. It has to have its own bathroom. It has to have its own separate entrance. It has to have a bedroom. Actually, it could be a studio too, but the key is food prep, bathroom, separate entrance. Doesn't need a separate electrical panel.
Anybody else want to add to that? Amy?
I do know that there are issues once these get implemented. The building inspectors or different inspectors in the town will be asking about the specifics of what the requirements then are for the ADU, and that's actually beyond my expertise. But I know Everett just adopted the law, and they were contacting me, and I kind of put them in touch with the Architects Association because they've been looking at some of the broader code issues. And I think that Arlington also, your inspectors, were sort of asking about implementation. I don't know if you know more.
Yeah, I mean, the one category I remember from Arlington was because it's essentially two dwellings in one structure, there had to be fire separation. So that was something that they were looking at.
I'm just gonna add one thing. I've also seen situations where when families construct these things, they make sure that the accessory unit is on a separate panel, because if a person with for example, with a disability is on public benefits, they can get a discount on their electric. And so by having it on a separate panel and in the name of the person with a disability, that ADU can get a 30% reduction in the cost of the electric bill.
Just one sec. Diab?
Yeah, I just realized I might be stepping into a very deep pool. So I'm Diab Jarius. I'm on the planning board as well as with I Ching. So the town of Winchester defines a separate dwelling unit, primarily as Kathy described. It doesn't talk about power or heating or all those utilities. There are separate building code which may apply, and that's when you're talking about the fire separation, but that's a separate thing. So that would be under state building code, anything which does that would follow that. So that's kind of a separate issue from the zoning, which is the use and dimensions and things like that. So I think I muddied the water rather than clarified it, but we still have to follow those. Yes, we still have to follow all of those, yeah.
For the people that go through the process of converting part of the home as an ADU, or, you know, it's a big process to go through, reselling their home, or potentially at the time when maybe the person with a disability or the older person who's 62 disappears from the dwelling, both the ADU and the dwelling itself. How does that affect the new purchasers that come on board? I mean, do I imagine a situation where the ADU has to stay vacant because it's not permitted to be used by anybody because no one has a disability or no one's 62 in the household?
So whenever it gets sold, it has to be recertified. And if there isn't going to be a use for those particular purposes, then it just gets absorbed into the primary dwelling. So it would then be considered just one family or single.
I think this law says that you can rent it out to seniors.
You can, right. So if you want to do that, or somebody with a disability.
Yeah, or to somebody with a disability. So if the person with the disability moved out and you're buying this house and it has the ADU, based on this bylaw in Winchester, you could then look for tenants who either are disabled or are seniors. But it just, having those restrictions may make it a little bit harder to rent it out, and then it's just a question of what the market is among seniors and people with disabilities.
So really good questions, and these are the kinds of questions, I think, as Mike said, and the fact that the planning board is unanimous and the select board is unanimous, I don't know if other boards will weigh in on this or not, that's all to our favor, and certainly the fact that there's now a 50% majority requirement, 51% requirement, is enormously helpful. But having said that, I think all of us who have been at town meeting have experienced this phenomena when somebody raises a question, there's not a real clear answer, other people start to raise questions, maybe there are answers, but people aren't really hearing them, and oftentimes the easiest thing to do is just simply say, I don't think this is quite ready yet, we want to indefinitely postpone this article. So we want everyone to be prepared for that kind of phenomena at town meeting. If you think, in fact, that this is something good, that this is a rather modest and maybe overdue proposal that could really make a difference for some people, we want everybody to be prepared. So if you have questions, I can imagine, I know in talking to people about the bylaw, the issue that came up for me, and I was kind of surprised, because these are folks who are, they think we have a housing problem, and they think that the town's gone crazy in terms of housing affordability, and there should be more housing, affordable housing options. But the notion of having a separate dwelling was something that kind of stopped them. They're kind of like, I don't know if I want to look out from my house and see another dwelling, back there. I don't know if I want to see that. I don't want, the idea of having it within the structure was not a problem. This is hardly a statistical sample, but we may find that there are, in fact, people who feel that way about it. And in fact, you know, Marty Jones, who knows a great deal about housing in our Commonwealth, happened to be at the Council of Aging the other day and making a presentation. And in describing the kind of, as I recall, Marty, the kind of decline in housing permits starting in the 80s, late 80s and into the 90s, as people kind of like, okay, I've moved to the suburbs. I really don't want to see any more housing in the community that I love and value. I think, you know, that's basically it. Let's make this as difficult as we can. So if it's 10 acres, you know, that's the minimum requirement or whatever it is. And so I think we just want to be thinking about that. People have questions about setbacks, questions about parking. They'll have questions about style and everything else. And that's the kind of discussion that we'll want to all be able to, you know, honestly and authentically engage in when we decide. Yep.
It seems to me that Arlington has been more generous with moving in the direction of ADUs than a lot of towns. And my question to you is, in the units that were approved for ADUs, did the unit have to have two egresses, two ways for people to get in and out because of fire considerations?
So I don't know the answer to that question. So far, we have only approved one, and I don't know if whether it had one or two entrances.
I assume, as was said before, the state building code and fire code all would apply.
Yes.
So
That
anybody
is
can
true.
correct me on that.
Steve, was it a first floor, a first level unit?
It would have been converting a garage. So,
So if it was first floor, you had the door and you had windows which conceivably fit the fire code. Yeah, if you were on a different level, I'm anticipating that might have been a different issue.
I suspect you are correct.
John?
I'm coming. Hold your horses.
John Serbier, in the spirit of Tom's request, could a member of the planning board or Brian Zacchelli elaborate a little bit on why the rationale for having the 62 age limit?
Go ahead, Brian.
Sure. So it was kind of a long conversation. It's hard to condense like a year's worth of conversation in a short amount of time. But generally, we wanted something that was going to pass town meeting. But we wanted it to be as progressive as it could be while being by right. That's kind of that's the shortest answer. If you look at other towns, you'll see that things that are by right, there's generally it's generally interior. There's not a ton of them that are completely by right. Like Arlington's, it seems like seems to be the most flexible out of all on the market currently. So not all of them are like that. We also knew that Winchester probably was not ready for such an all-encompassing bylaw. So yeah, I'll stop there if you have a follow-up, or if if I Ching or
think that
Sally
there was a
or
state- there- Oh, federal. But no, okay, the
So
state-
basically, the state's definition of elderly housing is 60 and up, and the Fed's definition of elderly housing is 62 and up. And we opted to go with the federal.
Sally? It's our mobile microphone delivery service.
It's aerobics class. So I think that the reason that we chose that, and I'm happy to be corrected by Kathy actually, but I've been thinking all along, it's because all of our town planning, the housing production plan, the master plan, has identified that there's populations in our town that are not being well served. And one of those is people who are seniors. And so then you decide, how do you set an age to a senior? I mean, I'm not senior yet, but I won't tell you how old I am. But so that's my point, was simply that it was according to all of our best thinking as a community about who we need to serve better, that our older citizens are part of that community.
Yeah. I know we, at the Jenks Center, we try to attract a younger contingent and not have them feel as if there's, you know, some problem with coming to the Jenks Center, right? And whether that be a 55-year-old, because, you know, we have programming that in fact can engage them, or a 62-year-old or a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old or a 90-year-old, right? You know, I think, you know, sometimes these decisions, you know, you do the best you can with doing something that gets your foot in the door. And so I don't fault anyone for having a more modest proposal and having the community experience what it's like to have it approved, and then decide if, in fact, 2 years later or 3 years later, in fact, this should be broadened to reach more people. And I kind of suspect that that will be the case, because I think the environment in which we're talking about housing in the metropolitan area of Boston is also changing. The role of the state in terms of exerting itself as to local decision-making is also, I think, expanding given the magnitude of the housing shortage. So I think the whole discussion is going to change over the next few years, I have a feeling, and we'll see more and more examples of in fact, cities and towns doing their part in this sort of broader housing shortage that we have.
If I could add one thing to that, both I Ching and I are realtors in town, and one of the things that we see more often is families who want to move to town and have 3-generation households. And you know, there are a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just because they like the family close to them. A lot of times it's because there's somebody who's older in the family while 1 or 2 of the parents are working, and the elder in the family is therefore able to provide some child care in the house, but may not want to deal in the kitchen with the adult child. I think of the kitchen as the crux. You can share almost anything in a house, but when you get 2 sets of adults in one kitchen, it tends to be a little more, I want to do it my way, they're set in their ways anyway. It doesn't necessarily turn out badly, but it has the potential to cause more friction. So an ADU that has its own small separate kitchen gives a little space, and that's what I think quite a number of people who are looking at Winchester to buy are looking at those options.
Yeah. I think this bylaw also could be viewed as a food fight reduction bylaw. So, you know, it's another segment that we can get support from, I think, yeah.
That's true.
Marty?
Yeah,
Marty
I'm
Jones.
Marty Jones. You know, to add to that, Felicity, too, I think we do have to remember it's not just seniors aging in place, but it may be families who want to be able to bring mom or dad from another place and have them live with them. And right now in town, there are not options of smaller units for somebody who wants to come live near their children and grandchildren. So that's another thing. I know a lot of people are thinking about the garage example, and I think it would be great if we don't have the answer tonight to make sure by town meeting we have the answer to, I think garages can be closer to the property line than a unit, a residential unit. Right, so if I have a garage, I'm gonna need a special permit or a variance or something. Yep, so I just think people are gonna wanna know that, because that's probably a pretty sizable source of possible, there's some lovely carriage houses and garages in town, and I think so people wanna understand how that would affect the existing structure they have.
Absolutely.
Mr.
Charlie?
Price, coming.
I'm just curious, if somebody's considering to doing something like this, how does it affect their real estate assessment in town? Is there any consideration when you're putting in a unit like this not to over-evaluate these things, because our taxes are so significant in the town already?
Really good question.
So I've talked with the assessor, excuse me, I've talked with the assessor here in town, and they were very clear that they would just be assessing what's there, meaning you have a bathroom, you have a kitchen, you have whatever, there's living space, no, nothing out of the ordinary. Yeah.
That's good.
That's a great question.
So if I may, I'd like to follow up on Marty's question. So this was the scenario you described, a garage close to the property line, was the motivation for was Arlington's motivation for putting a special permit requirement for a detached ADU less than 6 feet from the property line. So according to our zoning bylaw, an accessory structure has to have a 6-foot yard setback. However, garages of type 1 and type 2 construction, thing can go right up to type, I think it's type 1 and type 2, but basically a garage that's built of masonry that won't burn, it could be right on the property line. So you could have there's sort of like a separate set of rules for garages. And, that was the reason for the special permit requirements. Right, yeah, so, yeah, and the special permit, the criteria, our bylaw, aside from giving a special permit requirement, also gives the ZBA criteria. So the criteria is that the accessory dwelling unit, they essentially have to find that the accessory dwelling unit not be substantially more detrimental than the, permitted, than whatever the structure was beforehand. So yes, I know that's getting into the weeds, but since it may come up in your case.
Well, we'll just follow up on this question and then over to you.
I'm going to get into the weeds just a little bit in that currently in town, if you owned a garage which was 5 foot from a property line, you could put a family room or a den or whatever you wanted in that upper story and not go through any special permits. So when you think about it, there's a question of equity. Why would you want to single out this population, which we all agree needs this housing for special oversight, when we're not doing it for anyone else who's doing possibly the same sort of things except for putting in a kitchen? That would be the only difference perhaps. So if you have a carriage house which is large and you decided to put in a huge family room, or you wanted to put in a practice room for your choir, or whatever you want to do up there, you don't need a special permit. You can go right ahead and do it.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, following up on the tax questions. I live in an old house we do minimum maintenance on it now. My taxes every year miraculously seem like they go up 10%. They don't, but they go up significantly.
Right.
Now, if I were to convert my garage, which is about a foot from each of the property lines, what would the implications be? I mean, adding a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, that's going to be a huge impact on taxes.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to venture a comment. I assume that we're saying that the assessment would be based not on any kind of income that might be generated, but about the value of the improvements. But it does relate to market value, right? So.
Right, but it can't be sold separately, so it's not going to be treated like it was a condominium unit, right?
Yeah, but it would be treated as a house with an accessory dwelling unit, which for some people may have additional value. I mean, maybe for the assessor. I really don't know. I don't even want to speculate. But I do think that question is going to be one that presumably people are going to ask, just like the setback, the garage question, and maybe some of the other things that are coming up.
The idea of that improvement is that you would be able to use it as 2 separate units and to rent out one to help alleviate the taxes, right?
If I were to do something like that, I would probably, I would want to do something with the garage.
Right.
And building it up isn't an option. I'd move into that thing, maybe sell my house to my grandson.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
But, it's doable, but it's expensive.
Right.
Not
is
everybody in Winchester is a millionaire.
No, and that's been one of the restrictions I think people find, right, is that it's not cheap to do this, right? This is not something that is going to be an answer for everyone, right, by any stretch of the imagination. We need other kinds of options and solutions, you know, some of the other projects that are being approved and other things like that. But for some people, this can have real value.
I want to come back to something I Ching said, and I want to come back to something I Ching said, which was, and then what Felicity was saying about, you know, the change in the demographics in terms of who's moving into town. And I pulled some statistics from the census earlier this year, and in Winchester, 28% of our houses have children under 18, but 44.5% of our housing stock has 4+ bedrooms. We are way out of whack. At the same time, we have a higher, a higher percentage of elderly than the rest of the state does. So you can look at this as right sizing in terms of, you know, and particularly when you look at all of the large McMansions that have been going in, you wait. You know, somewhere down the line, those people with those McMansions are going to be retrofitting them to put ADUs in when they're, you know, for their kids or for them to downsize into. The question is, are they going to be legal or are they going to be illegal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're a few minutes past time, and I want to be respectful of that whenever we have one of these conversations. But if somebody has any other quick comments or anything? Betty?
Is there any funding for the homeowner to help with these projects?
I can't speak to the question of doing it just for people who are elderly, but in terms of disability, the state's home modification loan program can be, you can borrow up to $50,000 toward the cost of creating an accessory dwelling unit for a person with a disability to be able to remain in their home.
Now, does the relative have to live there, or can be somebody from, say you wanted to bring in somebody blind or?
It's either the homeowner or the landlord, and depending on the household income, it's either a 3% loan, or if the family has income at or below 200% of area median income, it is a 0% interest rate, all payment deferred until the title changes.
Yeah, that is impressive. Okay, so we're going to wrap that up. I want to thank you all again for being here. I was supposed to be moderator, but I'm also chair of the Council on Aging, and I know that I stepped into the advocacy role, but pardon that. I can't help it. I think this is a good idea. And I want to thank the Planning Board and the working group and all of you for being here. It's been great. And Nick, I want to thank Nick that turns the lights on and off here and makes it all set up right. So anyway, thanks everybody.